Alright, so today we're going to talk about conscientiousness. And I'm going to stick closer to my notes in some parts because a lot of the stuff I'm going to tell you about is really only stuff that I've learned in the last year or so. And so I'm not absolutely familiar with it yet. There's actually been a fair bit of progress made in understanding conscientiousness and in very surprising ways. Some of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today really shocked me when I learned it. You'll see, I mean, I've been interested in belief systems and ideology for a long time. And the role that, I'd never really understood the role that conscientiousness plays in that, so particularly, but it's really starting to come together. So not only are we going to talk about conscientiousness today, we're going to talk about, I think, some of the pathologies that are associated with conscientiousness, both at the individual level and at the social level. Now, it's a tricky topic because we've discussed this before to some degree. You know that intelligence and conscientiousness are the best predictors of life success, right? At least in managerial and administrative professions and in academia, and also in professions like the law, you know. So conscientiousness in many ways seems to be a very good trait. I don't think that you can have a civilized society without conscientiousness being at the base of it in some sense, because conscientious people do what they say they're going to do. They're industrious, they keep things in order. A lot of that's the basis for the kind of interpersonal trust that's necessary to set up complex trading systems. And as an individual trait, as I said, if you're conscientious, not only do you do better in life, but by the time you're middle-aged or so, your life quality seems to be much higher. So, you know, being conscientious seems to be a good long-term, medium to long-term strategy. So, that all sounds pretty positive, but then one of the things that a multitude of labs have been looking at over the last few years, including mine, is what happens if conscientiousness is taken too far. And it kind of looks, this is work that hasn't been published yet, but it's based on some of the new personality models that I've been looking at that have been derived using a different technique, a semantic analysis technique instead of factor analysis. And what appears to be the case is that any of the traits become pathological if you push them too far. So whatever virtue is, it can't be identified with a particular trait. I mean, I don't know what virtue would be from a Big Five perspective, but it doesn't look like you could localize it specifically. Maybe it's something like the appropriate situational balance of the temperaments, or one of the things I've been thinking is that maybe as you mature, your width of temperament increases. You know, so that maybe your baseline for conscientiousness is sort of average, but as you mature, your ability to be very conscientious when it's necessary and your ability to not be conscientious when it's necessary are more thoroughly developed and differentiated so that you could match your behavior more particularly to the demands of given situations. Maybe that's something like the development of wisdom. But anyways, it turns out that it appears that conscientiousness can take a very vicious turn if it's pushed beyond a certain point. And it also appears that perhaps the point at which conscientiousness is really positively associated with the success of individuals and maybe the success of nations is also relatively close to the point where if you push it any farther it starts to kick back very badly and things go downhill. And so that's the sort of thing that we're going to discuss today. So we'll put it in its context first. You remember the highest order personality traits are plasticity and stability, and plasticity is made up of extroversion and openness. Those are good predictors of long-term creative achievement. And then there's stability, and stability is associated with conscientiousness, emotional stability, and agreeableness. And we're going to concentrate on conscientiousness today, which is obviously, that's industrious and orderliness at the Big Five aspect scale level. Now, when we derived the Big Five aspect scale, so broke the Big Five down into 10, it wasn't clear to begin with what the aspects were going to be useful for, because when you do statistical analysis like that, you're just pulling out a semantic structure, and there isn't really any necessity that those additional differentiations that you make are going to have practical utility. But it's turned out that the distinction between orderliness and industriousness is extremely useful. So one of the things we know, for example, is that orderly people tend to be more conservative. So we know that conservative people tend to be more conscientious. but it seems to load specifically on orderliness. Now, you might say, well, that's not so surprising to associate the right wing with orderliness. But it is surprising because we didn't know that orderliness was a subset of conscientiousness. And so people have been trying since the end of World War II to slot the idea of the authoritarian personality into standard personality models. And that's been extremely difficult to do. You know, and so one hypothesis has been that conservative people, because they're more xenophobic and they're more, you know, they're more anti-immigration and they're more anti-gay rights and that sort of thing. And one primary theory has been that that's because they're more afraid. You know, but the problem is that conservatism isn't associated with neuroticism to any degree at all. And when it is, it seems to be reverse. It seems that the conservatives are less plagued by neuroticism than liberals are, say. So, I mean, you could make the hypothesis that the conservatives are so conservative that they're covering up their fear to such a degree that it actually reverses. But, you know, really, you gotta be pretty damn convinced of your theory to hold on to it when the data seem to indicate that the opposite, the actual opposite is true. And so,